Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kriti Garg, and I would like to welcome you to our presentation for today, Home Should Be a Safe Place for All, Affordable Housing and Domestic Violence. If we can go to the next slide, this event is part of SV at Home's Affordable Housing Month, where we dive deep into both our housing challenges and the solutions that we're building together. We still have over 15 events remaining during the month of May, from workshops on affordable housing finance to virtual story times and draw-alongs for the whole family, and expert panels like today's about the intersection of housing with education and health. Check out our calendar for more events like this one, and we'll drop the link in the chat. This program is also presented in partnership with the Coalition of Housers, or COHO, a new network for emerging leaders in the South Bay affordable housing industry. As the need for affordable housing grows, so does the need for supporting the leadership and professional development of a diverse community of housing advocates. COHO members collaborate with peers and experts, build skills and knowledge through workshops and trainings, deepen civic engagement, and lead projects. For more information and to sign up for the COHO newsletter, please see the link in the chat. And a quick housekeeping note before we get started, you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom window a Q&A section to type in questions for our speakers. We will have time for Q&A at the end, and please send us your questions there as we move through the slides and through the presentation. As you may know, 1 in 4 women and nearly 1 in 10 men will have experienced intimate partner violence or domestic violence at some point in their lives. We know that for many survivors of violence, safe and affordable housing can be a great challenge and critical to addressing domestic violence and supporting survivors. During this current shelter-in-place order, we are seeing increases in violence and abuse, and it is an especially isolating and frightening time for victims of domestic violence and their children. Today, we are pleased to present this webinar in collaboration with the Latina Coalition of Silicon Valley. We have 3 speakers whose organizations are on the front lines of meeting the needs of survivors of gender-based violence. First, we have Esther Diekman, Executive Director of Next Door Solutions to Domestic Violence, Aida Saldivar, Domestic Violence Services Manager at Community Solutions, and Jennifer Lopes, Senior Director of Housing and Development at YWCA Silicon Valley. We're grateful to have these speakers with us today. Our speakers will cover the needs of survivors, effective strategies for providing housing to survivors, their agency's current partnerships, and how housing advocates and providers like yourself can get involved and support. All right. Esther will help us kick off the panel today. Esther, can you give us an overview of the problem of domestic violence in Silicon Valley and the challenges for survivors, especially in light of the shelter-in-place order due to the pandemic?
Absolutely, Kriti. Thank you very much for the invitation and being part of today. Next Door Solutions has been in operation here in Santa Clara County for 49 years. We are the only standalone domestic violence agency serving anywhere between 2,500 and 3,000 unduplicated survivors every year. We have a partnership, obviously, first with our sister agencies, 2 of whom are here today. And so we can talk a little bit about domestic violence. And I thought it's a really good idea to first talk about what is domestic violence. Because I think even today, despite having outreach and education, and we're seeing more about domestic violence, we still get a lot of people who call us to say, I don't really know if what I'm experiencing is domestic violence. And so I think there's a lot of confusion. It's still a very difficult topic to undertake. So I think we'll start just with the general definition of what is domestic violence. We use different terms. Sometimes it's called intimate partner violence. Sometimes it's called spousal abuse. It can be dating violence, battering. And what it is, very simply, is people who inflict violence and abuse they use force or control to inflict emotional and physical harm to people. They want to exert power and control over another person. And they do that in a variety of ways. We see different forms of domestic violence, from financial abuse, where people sort of withhold the victim's pay, or use the immigration status against the victim. So there's any number of ways that people do that. Domestic violence agencies are equipped and knowledgeable about the different forms of abuse. So a lot of times our first reaction is, getting people to understand what is domestic violence. In terms of the scope of the problem, you know, in Santa Clara County, the first indicator of how, if a problem exists is number one, looking at the police calls for service. So with the 15 law enforcement agencies in Santa Clara County, if you take all of the 911 calls for domestic violence, when you put those together, they're anywhere from 5,600 to about 6,000 every year. If you position that to the four crisis lines for domestic violence that are operated here in Santa Clara County, we collectively get anywhere between 21,000 and 22,000 calls. So that's one indication of there's a lot of unreported violence. There, it is happening on a much bigger scale. And we understand that even the calls we get are not indicative of how many families are living in abuse and violence. We know that about 1 in 4 women and nearly 1 in 10 men, as Kriti mentioned, are going to experience domestic violence or IPV at some point in their lifetime. There are estimates that over 20 million children in the US are exposed to domestic violence and suffer pretty devastating short and long-term effects. We know as domestic violence agencies, anyone can be a victim. It's not tied to socioeconomic level, it's not tied to an ethnic group, gender, but we know that it's a very real phenomenon that happens across all communities. We are seeing a lot more men coming forward for services, and that's particularly difficult. Just with culture and just sort of our societal norms, you know, around men, it makes it very hard for a man who's experiencing domestic violence to step forward for help. But we're definitely seeing more of that happening. In terms of the scope of the problem, you know, our data nationally sort of shows that it's the largest cause of injury for women ages 15 to 44. We know that it mostly happens to women, but other groups also, you know, LGBTQ men will be victims of domestic violence at some point, you know, a great percentage of those. So I think it's sort of something that we all need to understand. It's a big problem. And today, hopefully we'll share information to kind of illuminate this affects all of us. It's not about the individual family. It's not about what the victim does or doesn't do. It's really about something that's impacting our community in a pretty significant way. And so, you know, one of the things that really concerns us is the research shows that when domestic violence happens, if children are present in a family, it's very likely that child maltreatment is happening. And so we want to make sure we pay attention to what is the impact of DV on children. We definitely know there's short-term effects. We definitely see things like anxiety, sort of physical manifestations, stomach aches and different things. And I think long-term, our biggest concern is with children who are exposed to violence, it's a learned behavior. They are very likely to repeat the patterns of either being victims or perpetrators. And so, you know, we want to really take a look at how this impact happens to children. And we also want to look at how it impacts health. Health is very important. We see very significantly that your health can be affected by violence you may be experiencing. And again, chronic conditions, high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, all these things have a connection to people who've lived in violence for a prolonged period of time. So we definitely are working to make sure survivors, even perpetrators, understand how this affects children, how this affects their health. And so one of the things that we're looking at now, there's a lot of focus on the impact of COVID-19 and the shelter-in-place order on domestic violence. And so what we see during this crisis, and really in any community crisis, is violence escalates, whether that's sexual assault, whether that's domestic violence, child abuse, because of the stress of people sort of having a sense of powerlessness, losing economic, you know, opportunities and jobs. All of this stuff exacerbates violence where it's already a problem. Those things don't necessarily cause the violence. It's sort of in families where there's violence and abuse, these conditions can escalate the violence. And that's what we're hearing as domestic violence agencies. The people that are calling in and our clients are saying, things are getting worse. We were doing okay until the shelter-in-place order, you know, came about. And what we're realizing is it's much more difficult for survivors to reach out for help. They're basically sheltered right now with their abusers. Making calls, reaching out for help, coming to our offices for services is really difficult. And so initially we saw a pretty significant drop in people even calling us because it wasn't safe. But now, you know, about 8 weeks into the shelter-in-place order, we're actually seeing numbers climb past what we normally get. So for Next Door Solutions, you know, we average about 14,000 calls a year, and that's about 40 calls a day. At the beginning of COVID, we went down to 6, 7 calls a day. We're back up now exceeding 40, which is the average amount of calls that we get. So it's definitely having an impact. It's challenging to provide services. All of our domestic violence agencies have had to move to a lot of remote virtual support, which is not ideal, but we're all managing to do that. And so, you know, today's webinar will sort of take us into a discussion about housing and shelter. And we hope that, you know, it'll be informative and people can ask us questions along the way.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Esther. My next question is for Aida. Aida, can you give us an overview of the housing needs and challenges for survivors?
Thank you. So the needs with our survivors are very, very similar to the needs of our general homeless population. You know, if folks are homeless for many reasons, but our survivors, it has to do with a lack of resources. It has to do with the appropriate job skills to be able to secure safe, affordable housing. So it's the same thing as our general homeless population. But in addition to that, there are some other challenges that our survivors face. And it has to do with, for example, financial abuse. When our survivors stay with their abusers, we have found that abusers will sabotage the victim's economic stability by ruining their credit record, by not allowing them to go to work, so therefore they don't have jobs, so they become more vulnerable to homelessness. And for example, if a person who is homeless and is a survivor is trying to secure some type of housing, their credit record is ruined. But there's an eviction that's on their record as a result of the violence they encountered while they were their survivor. So there's challenges around that, about financial abuse. There's also challenges around mental health and post-traumatic stress. When our survivor is faced with abuse, it doesn't go away. It's not like you forget about it tomorrow. It's something that we have to work with our survivor to make them healthy so that they can again overcome post-traumatic stress. So really empowering our survivors to move forward, not only economically, but stability in terms of their mental health. So our survivors are faced with two things. They're faced with being at or below the poverty line. So there's that cycle of poverty that they're faced with. In addition to that, there's a cycle of violence that is happening at the same time. So there's two cycles that our survivors are exposed to: cycle of violence and cycle of poverty. And so how do we work through that? And so it's about bringing that to the forefront, bringing the appropriate services to our clients so that they can move forward. And it's really up to them to decide where they want to start. So it's about advocacy, empowerment of our survivor.
Thank you, Aida. I'd like to ask Jen next to explain trauma and how this impacts survivors, and also share why it's important for housing and social service providers to have a trauma-informed planning process.
Thank you. So as Aida was saying, there are certain challenges that our survivors face. One of them is the trauma. And as she mentioned, it doesn't just go away tomorrow. It's something that sticks with the survivor for an indefinite period of time. And so we have to recognize that survivors have different experiences than others may have, and that also affects their ability to secure housing. Some of the things that survivors need to be concerned about when they are looking for housing is it's also about their safety, their emotional safety, their physical safety. It's all about the client's choice of what they want for their housing needs. So we're very client-centered in how we work with our clients and survivors to help them find the housing that meets their needs. We need to be able to give survivors control over their environment and their choices. And we also have a space of protecting the confidentiality of survivors as we work through this process. And sometimes that's very difficult for housing providers to understand as we're trying to place survivors in housing is that we have the obligation to secure their confidentiality. We don't have to disclose to landlords or housing providers anything about the client's circumstances. Often it is difficult in dealing with landlords, especially with the types of programs that our survivors are enrolled in that helps them secure their housing. There isn't a system that works for everyone, and it's very independent based on the survivor's needs. So it becomes very challenging in trying to bridge that with landlords and other housing providers that we try to work with, and showing that our survivors, each one has their own different need and they need support and they need to make those choices that are best for them. So working with a client-centered approach is how we go about in securing housing for our clients.
Thanks, Jen. For our next section, I'd like to move into discussion about the effective strategies for housing survivors and any systems gaps that we want to talk about. So Aida, we know that there are 4 domestic violence emergency shelters and hoteling available in Santa Clara County. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that works?
Certainly. So working very closely with our sister organizations, collectively we have 63 beds for emergency housing of our survivors, victims when they call us. And that's spread throughout the county. And the process is that survivors are connected to us through our crisis line. Each one of our sister organizations all hold a crisis line, which they are able to call. And so once we receive the call from the victim, we assess what the situation is. You know, when the survivor is calling us, they've had a lot of courage. They had to build up a lot of courage to call us. So it's important that when we receive the call, that we're validating their situation, that we're acknowledging the situation that they're in. And so once we have assessed the need for emergency housing, we try to see if we have space at our individual shelter. If we don't, then rather than having the survivor call the other sister organizations and repeat their story, we call on their behalf to the other shelter to see if they have space to bring in this person and their family. If they don't, well then we make the arrangement to hotel that client. And it could be, depending on the emergency, depending on the need of that particular family, it could be a couple of days until there's an emergency protective order and he's moved out, or it could be up to 2 weeks, depending on some legal issues that we have to work with, such as a restraining order, a move-out order. So it really depends on each situation. Each situation is different. But really it's about safety. Like I said, when a person is calling the crisis line, it's because they built up a lot of courage, and it's really hard decisions for them to make. And so we just want to make sure that it's about safety, that they're safe, that they're being validated, the situation they're going through, and we work through the issues. And like I said, every situation is different. It could be a day, it could be 2, it could be 2 weeks, it could be 3 weeks. And so we work with the families to ensure safety for themselves and their children.
Thank you. Esther, this next question is for you. So Next Door Solutions was one of 8 agencies that piloted something called DV Housing First. Mm-hmm. Can you share more about this model and its effectiveness at meeting the needs of survivors?
Yes, thank you. About 3 or 4 years ago, we were one of 8 cities, 8 organizations in California that were giving the opportunity to embark on something called Domestic Violence Housing First. And so the model is basically taking an innovative approach to looking at housing, looking at the needs of survivors and their families. And it focuses on helping the survivors obtain safe and affordable housing through a spectrum. You know, I either shared a little bit about shelter and what happens when people are in crisis, but there's a whole continuum that we'll be talking about today. In terms of DV Housing First, it is designed to provide very flexible funding for the wide range of needs that survivors have. And it's really homelessness prevention. Can we keep a survivor safely housed and prevent homelessness Can we move to either, have her stay where she is if it's safe, or to move to another place and provide the financial support? So it's very much, what Jen was talking about. It's survivor driven. It is really a choice we want to give survivors. It is trauma informed. We have to remember PTSD, trauma issues can surface at any time, can be triggered. And the idea of mobile advocacy, we have to go to where survivors are if they can't get to us. So that's one of the pillars that we see in the Housing First model, the DV Housing First, the flexible funding. She may need, childcare because her mother-in-law was watching the kids and now doesn't want to do that. Maybe the perpetrator moves out of the house and now she's got to pay a mortgage. She needs a couple of months to get on her feet and to find a roommate. So domestic violence housing first funds offer a very flexible way to support their financial needs so they can stabilize. And then community engagement is another big element to that. Partnerships, public, private, non-governmental. Those are all things that the Housing First model really supports. And so, the idea that we have a question that we ask as a community, which is when we sometimes don't say it, but we're thinking it. And why doesn't she just leave? And, we're sharing some of the barriers to why, people don't leave. And we don't really look at why doesn't the perpetrator stop abusing people? Why do we have to move the victim? Why can't we move the perpetrator? So Housing First is offering us an opportunity to sort of look at all that. There was a pilot of the original 8. The DV Housing First model is now being used by over 30 organizations, including the YWCA and including Community Solutions. And so we're really excited that it is showing success. I think initially there was a sense of, well, if we're too flexible with funding, people are going to take off with the money. And then what do we do? That absolutely wasn't what we saw. The model has been evaluated at least 3 times. And we're finding some really significant outcomes in terms of it is keeping people housed. It is working. The money is being used efficiently. It's a much cheaper model than having to go into homelessness. And so I think for us, what's exciting is it wasn't as costly as we thought. People are getting help and people are staying housed. So DV Housing First is something that I think we need to continue to watch. We're actually seeing it funded in Santa Clara County now. So that's all, a great opportunity for us and for survivors.
That's excellent. Aida, I know, as Esther mentioned, that Community Solutions is also using the DV Housing First model. Can you share a little bit about how your agency has implemented this in South County, so the Gilroy-Morgan Hill area?
Certainly. So our program is a little bit different from Esther's, and Esther, you're doing a wonderful job with your program. Our program is a 3-year program. And so what we do is that we acknowledge that housing is stability for our families. They need to be housed first before they can make any progress in any other parts of their lives, such as education or job skills or working with their families. It's really important that they have a safe place that they can go home every night to. So what we do is that we have taken 20 of our clients, applying the Housing First model, 20 of our existing clients, and offering them a 3-year program. So we know that the first year of our program, there are a lot of issues that folks are going to have to work through. First, they're coming into a new housing program. They haven't been housed in a while. So to have their own home is significant. The second piece to that is working through some of those mental health issues that both Jen and Esther alluded to, post-traumatic stress. And so it's working through those issues so that they can focus on other parts of their lives. So therapy in our program is extremely important. Case management is really important, getting people back to get into a daily routine of how to be successful. And so it's about therapy, it's about case management, and we had another component, which is life coaching. We really want them to know that we're just coaching them. We're going to stand side by side with them. We're not going to make decisions for them. We're going to have them identify which parts of their lives they want to work on first and be their partner. Whatever they want, we're going to support them. And we're going to be their safety net because, as Esther mentioned, people are triggered very easily. So safety in this program is extremely important. Making sure that their restraining orders are in place, making sure that they know that they can report if someone comes back to them, if the abuser comes back to harass them. working with other organizations. We don't say that we're the expert in this. We just know that we are going to afford them the opportunity to have safe housing. We're going to have them create their own opportunities to make those changes in their lives that they want to make, and we're going to be their safety net. And we have found, it's my experience, that the first year we're working through some real delicate issues and triggering issues. The second year we can really focus on job skills and moving forward and improving that so their resources improve. And the third year really is about, now let's just move you off the program now, because now you can make this on your own.
Great, thank you, Aida. For this next section, Jen, can you provide us an overview of all the components of an ideal continuum of housing services for survivors?
Sure. So our agency, the YWCA Silicon Valley, we have set up a housing continuum for survivors. And what that continuum looks like is survivors, as Aida had mentioned, they call in through the support line for emergency housing. We have shelter space available. We do an intake to see if that is a suitable situation for them. If we don't have shelter space available, we have the ability to hotel or motel clients by their choice. So we have our moteling and shelter, which is sort of that emergency housing piece where we get the client safe and out of their situation. From that, we have rapid rehousing programs where those individuals, the objective of that is to house individuals as soon as we can and provide them the rental assistance and the other financial assistance needs, as Esther and Aida were mentioning, that survivors may need. Could be around childcare. It could be around they need to take a test or a certification for a job employment. They need to buy things for their new home. Any of those, moving them into a rapid rehousing program. From a rapid rehousing program, the hope is that we're able to work with that survivor for a period of time. Most of the rapid rehousing programs are designed in a way where there's a 12-month subsidy or rental assistance. There is flexibility in providing longer terms for those subsidies, which we are seeing is required, especially during this pandemic, where a lot of survivors lost jobs, lost their primary source of income. So they weren't able to, they may have been paying half of their rent, and now at this point they can't pay any of their rent. So they have the ability to rely on our program to help them with the assistance for the rent. So they're able to remain housed and not back into a homelessness situation. There's also the permanent supportive housing, where depending on a client's needs, a lot of times tied to more mental health needs, would be recommended for a permanent supportive housing program. And that is supported in the same way, where they're receiving intensive case management as well as assistance for their housing needs. Finally, the hopes is that we can move them into a permanent affordable housing situation. So what that could look like is the agency having their own units that are affordable and providing those housing options for clients. So it's really from the emergency entrance into sort of the immediate find housing to the point of making a long-term sustainable housing situation for a client that they will be able to endure and not return to a state of homelessness.
Thank you, Jen. And finally, before we open up for questions, I'd like to ask our speakers to talk about any effective housing partnerships that they've undertaken. So we'll start with Esther. Esther, can you share a little bit more about the Home Safe Partnership, which was the first partnership between a DV agency and a housing developer? How does this work, and what lessons have you learned?
Thank you, Preeti. I think, it was 1998 when our agency, Charities Housing and Life Moves, then called Envision, sort of joined forces to say, can we raise the funding to create, housing for survivors? And that, at that time, we really saw that as transitional housing. Once people get stabilized and sort of are ready to move to the next level, there's a need for transitional housing. And so I think at the time, it was the intention of these organizations to really look at how do we provide housing so that people can be there for a longer period of time. And so we embarked on raising the money together So each organization contributed money for the construction of 2 sites, one in Santa Clara and one in San Jose. So each site has 24 units of shared housing. And so shared housing means 4 families can live in a single unit with a shared kitchen. And so we've been operating that since that time in partnership. And so what it looks like today it's moved to a more permanent supportive housing model. There are different ways that it's funded now, different partners. And so, HUD begins to play a role in how we can subsidize and support the clients that are living there. And I think what we see now is a need for a variety of things. Number one, there are people who can come to HomeSafe or any sort of, the middle of that Jen's describing, kind of the transitional or, phase, and they can move on to the next phase, which would be permanent housing, right? And they have the ability to do that with services like Aida described. If we're looking at their economic need and trying to move them forward, we can have success where they move on to what's ideal for them, permanent housing. We open up space and more people can come in. I think one of the challenges that we're experiencing now is the lack of housing in Silicon Valley, the lack of sufficient income. At Next Door Solutions, most of our clients are low and very low income. And so it becomes a challenge to try to match what limited housing is available with people's ability to pay rent. If you're disabled, if your PTSD is so severe and the trauma, you're not able to work. So we do see clients who are not able to move to a job that are permanently going to be disabled. And so all those things have to be taken into account when you're planning for housing for survivors of domestic violence. And I think that partnership has been with the 3 organizations, but there are community partners that play a very important role. People that can come in and do workshops, classes, provide other services that the clients may need, therapy, counseling, all of those things are part of like a community collaboration. So that's another thing that's worked for the partnership, bringing in other partners who are funded and have the expertise to do certain things. And then always looking at children. There are a huge number of children at these places. And so it's important to not look at housing just as the survivor, but it is also a lot of children in the mix. So I think it's been an evolving partnership, and we deal with the current crisis. That's having a huge impact. The COVID crisis is having a huge impact. So the collaboration evolves. The collaboration has to be recalibrated every few years. But we're really proud that we've served hundreds of people through the HomeSafe programs. And we look forward to, the next phase, which will be to sort of revisit, can we reconstruct these housing units? Because shared housing is hard. We have learned since 1998. It didn't turn out the way we thought. We kind of thought the survivors would work with each other, help each other out, but it is very stressful to put families who are dealing with trauma. The other, I think, thing is the trauma doesn't just end after one incident. Sometimes people can get triggered. Sometimes abusers come back to create problems in the life of the survivor and children. So, those are always things that we have to navigate in the partnership. But we are really excited that it's beginning to expand and we see other partnerships with DV agencies happening.
Thank you, Esther. Aida, as you mentioned, Community Solutions operates transitional housing. So how are DV agencies engaging in the owning and operating of transitional housing?
Thank you. Yes, so we currently have 2 small pilot programs that we're partnering with the Office of Supportive Housing. And so I'll talk a little bit about our first program. So being naive, Esther, you mentioned that shared housing can be a little challenging. We actually have rented 2 homes in the city of Gilroy and Morgan Hill, where it's shared housing. So we house, 9 folks and their children, small families. And it's extremely difficult to do that. Now that I found out, it takes a lot of time and a lot of education on our part and the client's part. Mediation is huge. Keeping clients separate and not sharing their intimate story so it doesn't cause problems is huge. But we're at a point where they're not talking to each other and they actually are able to create their own house rules within boundaries. And so that empowers folks to be part of their community. So that piece is working. But at the very beginning, when we first went out to secure these homes, extremely important for us to find homes that are in safe areas. Most of our clients have not been in safe areas. they haven't been in safe homes, and they haven't been in safe areas. So it's important that we locate and secure homes in really nice, safe areas for our clients, that they're in good school districts, so the children are able to go to good school districts, in good schools. And so the first part of that is really contacting landlords and convincing them why they should partner with us, the DV organization, and getting rid of all those myths around domestic violence. And, you know, we're just bringing them to the attention, bringing them aware that it could be your neighbor, it could be your sister. It's one of those crimes that is hidden for a very long time. So just bringing awareness of what domestic violence really is, that it can happen to any of us at any given time, is really, really important. Also, talking to landlords about this win-win situation. You know, when you encounter many landlords, like how can I help end homelessness? But we bring to their attention that the growing number of homelessness, especially in our county, is women and children who have been exposed to domestic violence. So bringing that awareness to the landlords is extremely important, and what they can do to give back. And they can give back by entering into a partnership with us. And as long as the home is in good condition, they take care of their home, we take care of the social issues. So it really is about identifying that physical asset and protecting that physical asset, that we're going to be part of that and collaborating with the landlord. It is an investment on his part. And for us, it's really about the human investment. And it's a real balance. There's a physical investment that we have to protect, but there's also this very critical human investment and a human component. It's part of who we are as a society. And so there's a physical asset and a human asset. Extremely important that we bring that to balance and bring that to the forefront as we're creating programs. So that's what we do. In we have 2 houses. We have a total of about 12 individuals, small families and their children. The second piece is we have a small pilot program where we know that there's some people who cannot live in a shared environment, such as single moms with special needs children, for example, autistic children, older adults, male survivors. And so we have a small program where we have scattered sites. And so again, it's about investing time into building partnership with landlords in our county. It's about giving the client the opportunity to figure out where they want to live. Because at the end of the program, we want them to stay there. So it's about affordability. Can they afford something now? And then thinking 3 years down the line, can they afford that in 3 years with rents that keep creeping up? So really important that the client is educated around that piece, and landlord knows that the collaboration with us would be a win-win situation. And so there are 2 small programs. In total, we have about 18 clients enrolled in this program in these different types of transitional housing. But I do have to say that the important thing around transitional housing, as it's 6 to 24, sometimes 36-month program, is the partnership with our landlord and bringing awareness to them around the issues of domestic violence. And then it can affect anyone in our community at any given time. It's not just one gender. It could be any gender. And that as a social service organization, we need to partner with those folks who have the means to help us end homelessness, especially for those folks who are survivors. And again, it's about breaking that cycle of poverty and that cycle of being homeless and violence.
Thanks, Aida. And Jen, so we have an opportunity today to share more about how housing developers can partner with DV agencies to address the housing needs of survivors. So how has the YWCA embarked on acquisition, partnering with housing developers, and navigating finance?
Yeah, so YWCA Silicon Valley has partnered with Charities Housing a couple of years ago to acquire 63 apartment units that are above our service space in downtown San Jose. The intention of that partnership was to be able to eventually, as units become vacated, to be able to set aside a certain number of units to move survivors into. The units are affordable, 50% or less of AMI, and this would allow the opportunity for us to be able to provide safe and secure housing that's affordable, as well as be connected to our services because they're right above the service space that we currently occupy. So the intention of that was to ensure that we could build a good partnership with a housing developer, provide the housing needs of clients, as well as the services at the same time. As both Esther and Aida have highlighted, most of our clients are single wage earner families or zero income earning families. They are the low income families in our community, and what is really predominant right now is the lack of units that are available, but most importantly that there's nothing that meets these affordability needs. And without the assistance that is being provided to survivors through our programs, none of these individuals would be able to afford housing in this county, especially that a lot of the household sizes are not just a single individual or a single person and one child. We're seeing large household sizes, which we would like to ask that housing developers take that into consideration as they are building housing projects in this community, is to recognize that studios and one bedrooms are not necessarily the needs for our community members that are the lowest income population. They need larger spaces for their families. And so that's something we would like housing developers to consider as they move forward with projects, not only for survivors, but just even for our low income community members. We are also partnered with Eden Housing at a couple of their housing developments as we provide childcare services for their developments. And so we also are looking for partnerships in that space because YWCA does provide childcare. We provide low income or no cost childcare. So being able to partner up with developers to provide that need for community members as well, and be able to work to set aside units in future developments for a particular population of survivors. And we're also always looking ourselves for opportunities of land acquisition or other properties that maybe need to be rehabilitated. And then navigating through the opportunities for financing that our county currently offers. We have a Measure A ballot that was passed that provides financing for affordable housing. So looking how we could partner with the developer to leverage that financing for the service needs they may need for their development. So really want to be a very good community partner for providing affordable units, as well as units that could be designated for survivors, because we do see the need for that. So we want to be able to grow those partnerships and continue that with the developers in our community.
Great, thank you, Jen. And thank you all for your excellent presentation and answers. At this time, I'd like to open up the discussion for any questions or comments for the group to consider. As mentioned previously, you can enter your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We do have a couple of questions to start. And our first question is from Gabriela Chavez Lopez. How does immigration status or language barriers play a role in survivors seeking services? How are your organizations addressing this?
I'd be happy to respond to that and just start with that. And of course, the other two presenters can jump in. Immigration status is always, I think, a perceived barrier to getting help. Many undocumented families are just afraid to reach out, and they want to stay under the radar, especially in the immigration climate we have in this country right now, and the increased focus on deportation that is being driven by the federal level. In terms of immigration status, every organization has the ability to work with undocumented survivors. We're certainly really sensitive to the needs of those undocumented survivors. They don't necessarily qualify for governmental programs, but we have other resources and funding that can support them. So there's not a single DV agency in Santa Clara County that will turn an undocumented family away. It is a safe thing. We are confidential. We will not require them to do anything. If they don't want to go to the police, if they don't want to, connect with systems, they just want to have help for staying safe and addressing the violence, we can do that. As you know, we mentioned earlier, this is survivor driven. Whatever's in the best interest and works for that survivor, that's what we're going to do. So we want that to be an important point for people to share. People who are undocumented can still get help if they're dealing with violence and abuse. And that includes sexual assault, human trafficking. So that's one way we do it. I can let one of the other folks talk about the language barriers and how our services are offered.
Thank you, Esther. Community Solutions is focusing down in South County, and so our population, I wouldn't say that of the folks that we serve, it's about 55%, 60% of our clients are Spanish speakers. Of that percentage, probably another 25 are undocumented. But as Esther already said, no one is turned away because of status. If anything, we connect into immigration attorneys. So if they want to pursue some kind of immigration remedy, they're able to. And also we use the promotora model, because as Esther says, sometimes people don't want to come and approach us. And so we have promotoras who are survivors, and we train them on how to go out to our communities and talk about our services, talk about domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking, and know that they can be connected to an organization that can help them move through some of those issues that they're facing, and it's all confidential. And so we've had really good success in the counties that we serve. So we're in South Santa Clara County and San Benito County. And that's been a very successful program for us.
Great.
I would just add that everything that Esther and Aida said is the same thing that YWCA is doing. We have several bilingual staff members that are able to help with any language barriers. We don't turn anyone away based on immigration status, and we use all the same resources and practices that the other agencies are.
I wanted to add one more thing, Kriti. Every agency operates language line. So no matter what language dialect you speak, you can be helped in, and so the caller will be connected with translation on the line. All 5 agencies do that. So that's another plus. Language is not a barrier to getting services from a domestic violence agency.
In addition to that, we also reach out to our sister organizations. For example, we reach out to OPKI quite often, or to Maitri, to help us connect that client and making sure that they get the appropriate services.
Thank you. Our next question, we have several questions. I'll try to get to as many of them as possible during this time. For Jen, how would, and others feel free to jump in as well, how would your financing needs intersect with things like community land trusts and public banking? Or how about infill housing, such as putting a fourplex on a former single family home lot in a formerly all single family housing neighborhood with good schools? How would that interface with what you're working on and with survivors' needs as well?
So great questions. We are definitely looking for any opportunity to increase the number of units in the inventory. So perfect example of even looking for a 4-unit apartment building and making it into 8 units, or buying a single family home and being able to convert it into a fourplex. Those are all strategies and ideas that we're constantly looking at. It's just that the opportunities are few and far between for some of those, just depending on which area of the county that we're looking in. We are open to any and all financing needs, definitely partnering up with community land trusts, public banking, private venture capitalists, anybody that is supporting the mission that our agency is, as well as supporting the increase in inventory of affordable housing. But nothing is not considered. We're not just looking for that piece of land, let's build an apartment building. We're looking at anything that would increase our inventory to have availability for increasing the housing units. So those are all things that we are considering. It's just looking and making sure it's the right opportunity. As Aida had highlighted, making sure that the opportunity is in a safe and secure neighborhood where there's close by resources for survivors. A lot of our survivors rely on public transportation. So making sure that it's in an area where they could easily get their child to school, they could easily get medical resources that they need, be able to go to the store, hopefully near a public transit line that's easy for them to access. So all of that is taken into consideration as we're looking for opportunities.
Great. Esther, did you want to add anything on that one?
No, I think, you know, we're so desperate for housing in Silicon Valley. It sort of sometimes feels like we'll take anything that's out there and just build something. You have to think about the fact that with our housing, you know, units, whether they're transitional or the permanent supportive, you got about half of those folks there with kids. And so there's a lot of children in the mix. So there have been ideas kicked around about where we could use this abandoned building or this space. First question I would ask would be, would you raise your children in that neighborhood, in that environment? And we have to think of the needs of the survivors as a unit, as a family. Where are the healthy, safe places? Are they near parks? Are they safe? And, you know, this is something echoed by Jennifer and Aida. It's not just throwing people in or mixing populations. You know, we have funding for the mentally ill with the domestic violence, and somehow it all works together. We need a lot more careful thought, which is why the domestic violence agencies have to be included in the dialogue for housing for Silicon Valley. We can tell you best what are the needs and how to accommodate those needs.
Great. And then last question, what should we do if we are sheltering in place and it sounds like our neighbors may be having an incidence of domestic violence? Just want to make sure we have that question answered before we wrap up.
So the question was, what do we do with our neighbor? And so maybe we can put up the crisis line phone numbers. And also, we operate a safe chat room. So if folks cannot get to a phone to give us a call, then if they can get into our safe chat, and there's an advocate who can respond to them the same way that we would respond to them on a crisis line. And if you really feel that it's happening, call the police. Call them to go out and respond to the situation that's happening. Shelter in place means that they're staying with the abuser because they think they don't have anywhere to go. And just know that we're here to help them through this crisis. And so we can put up the crisis line numbers and or the safe chat number or the website to the safe chat. That would be good, so they all have it.
Kriti, I think you have a question here that I think is really important, and it was around Latinas seeking domestic violence services. So I just wanted to share, Next Door Solutions, the majority of our clients come from the Latino community, about anywhere between 60 and 65% on an annual basis. You know, this year alone, we have nearly 1,200 Latinas that we serve just, you know, since July. And so, you know, 1 in 3 Latinas, according to national statistics, will experience intimate partner violence. The thing to remember, and Jen sort of alluded to this, and so did Aida, around there are other needs and economic needs, the different things. So you got to take a look at the bigger picture for the Latina community. And that is, they are the least likely to graduate from high school, most likely not to even be ready for kindergarten. The bigger concentration in low wage workers, the more vulnerable workforce is heavily Latina. Latinas are overrepresented in the juvenile justice system and the adult correctional system. So there are huge challenges for survivors who are Latinas. We as agencies serve and work a lot with Latinas. And I think we really do need sort of an effort to hone in on what are the needs here. COVID-19, there's an enormous amount of Latinas still in the workplace with children, single wage earners, as Jen, you know, offered earlier. So every organization, every decision maker should be looking at what is happening to the Latina community in Silicon Valley, because it has huge implications across our spectrum in our efforts to build a healthy, safe, sustainable economy. So I'm really happy that Latina Coalition was co-hosting today because they focus on those issues. They're definitely an organization we've worked with in the past. So just kind of wanted to respond a little bit to that.
Great. Thank you so much. We
Can I
do
add just one thing to that? Thank you, Esther. I think it's also important to note that as people are returning to work, that our Latinas may return to work, but they're going to return to work with reduced hours. And so therefore our homeless situation it doesn't get better, it gets worse. And I don't anticipate it getting, it's going to get worse in the next year and a half. Especially with Latinas.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer those questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time for all of our questions today, but our panelists are available to be contacted. We've included the link to the Safe Chat and the 24/7 hotline for our county in the chat. And we're really excited to see so much interest in building more partnerships and building more solutions together. So on behalf of SV at Home and the Latina Coalition of Silicon Valley, Next Door Solutions, Community Solutions, and the YWCA Silicon Valley, we want to thank our panelists and all of you for being a part of this important discussion. We will send out a follow-up email shortly, and please feel free to reach out for any additional information you'd like from us as well. A quick note, once you close out of this webinar, you'll also see a link to a feedback form. So please take a minute just to fill it out. It's really helpful for us in our future programming. Thank you all for being here with us. Thank you to Ida, Esther, and Jen. I'm really grateful for our collaboration and for all of your wisdom and thoughts today. And have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.